Hey everyone, and welcome to Legends and Lore. I'm David Culpepper. Thanks for joining me today. Whenever I mention I'm doing an episode on the Bermuda Triangle, people immediately start telling me their own theories. And I get it, there's something fascinating about a place where things just disappear. Let me paint you a picture. It's December 5th, 1945. It's a beautiful afternoon in Florida. The kind where the sky meets the ocean in this perfect blue line. 5 Navy planes are out on a training mission, something they've done hundreds of times before. But then things get weird. The lead pilot's voice comes over the radio, and you can hear the confusion. We cannot be sure of our position. Everything is wrong. We cannot be sure of any direction. Strange. Those planes, never seen again. And here's the kicker. The rescue plane sent to find them, that vanished too. 14 experienced airmen, just gone. Today we're taking our time to really explore this notorious stretch of ocean that's captured imaginations for decades. No rushing, no sensationalism, just you and me diving into one of the most talked about mysteries of the sea. Welcome to the Bermuda Triangle. Before we dive into the really strange stuff, we should probably talk about what we mean when we say Bermuda Triangle. Grab a map with me for a second. If you drew a line from Miami to Bermuda, then down to Puerto Rico and back to Miami, you'd create this rough triangle. We're talking about roughly 500,000 square miles of open ocean. That's bigger than Alaska. This area has been a major shipping route pretty much since humans started crossing the Atlantic. The Spanish used it for their treasure fleets, actual treasure ships. And today it's still one of the busiest stretches of ocean you'll find. Thousands of ships and planes cross through it every day without a problem. But here's where it gets interesting. The term Bermuda Triangle didn't just appear out of nowhere. A guy named Vincent Gaddis coined it in a 1964 magazine article. Before that, people just called it the Limbo of the Lost, or my personal favorite, the Devil's Triangle. Though I've got to say, if I were sailing through there, I think I'd prefer we stuck with the more neutral Bermuda Triangle. Speaking of sailing through there, remember that disappearance I mentioned at the start, Flight 19? That incident really kicked off the modern mystery of the triangle. And let me tell you, it's even stranger than it first sounds. Want to hear the full story? Because this is where things get really interesting. So, picture this. It's December 5th, 1945, just a few months after World War II ended. Out of Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers take off for what's called Navigation Problem Number 9. Pretty routine stuff. Fly out, drop some practice bombs, do some navigation exercises, fly back. The kind of training flight these guys had done dozens of times. The weather? Perfect. The crews? Experienced. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, had about 2,500 flying hours under his belt. Sure, most of his crew were students, but they weren't rookies. Everything's going fine until about 3:30 in the afternoon. That's when Taylor's voice comes over the radio, sounding confused. He says, "My compass is gone." Now, one compass failing? Okay, that can happen. But then all 5 planes start reporting compass problems. Here's where it gets really weird. Taylor becomes convinced they're somewhere over the Florida Keys. But his crew members, they think they're over the Atlantic. And if you're a pilot, that's a pretty big difference. You're either over land or, well, nothing but ocean. So for the next 3 hours, these planes are flying around, getting more and more lost, burning through fuel. The radio transmissions become increasingly desperate. Ground control is trying to help. Other pilots are listening in, but nobody can seem to get them back on track. As the sun starts to set, the weather turns bad. The last transmission they hear from Flight 19 is just static and a few garbled words, and then nothing. The Navy immediately launches a search operation. They send out a Martin Mariner flying boat, essentially a massive rescue plane with an experienced search and rescue team. That rescue plane, it vanished too, just disappeared right off the radar screen. 27 people, 6 aircraft, gone without a trace. The Navy launched one of the biggest search operations they'd ever conducted. We're talking hundreds of boats and aircraft scouring the area. 500,000 square miles of ocean searched inch by inch. They were out there for over 2 weeks. You know what they found? Nothing. Not a life jacket, not an oil slick, not even a piece of debris. All that searching, and it's like those planes and that rescue or aircraft just vanished into thin air. Now, I gotta tell you something interesting. Years later, the Navy's official report called it cause unknown, but they included this little detail that most people don't talk about. They said Taylor had a history of getting lost while flying. He'd even had to ditch in the Pacific twice during the war because he got disoriented. But here's the thing. Even if Taylor got lost, how do you explain 6 planes disappearing without leaving any trace? And those compass problems they reported? That's something we see coming up again and again in Bermuda Triangle stories. Speaking of which, Flight 19 wasn't the first disappearance in these waters, and it definitely wasn't the last. There's this other case that happened way back in 1918 that's even more baffling. Ever heard of the USS Cyclops? Imagine a massive naval cargo ship, longer than a football field, just disappearing. Picture this massive ship, 542 feet long, carrying 11,000 tons of manganese ore and over 300 crew members. The USS Cyclops was one of the biggest ships in the American fleet at the time. They called these ships bridge ships because they were so long they could almost bridge a city block. March 4th, 1918, the Cyclops leaves the Caribbean heading for Baltimore. The weather conditions? Perfect. The crew? Experienced. The ship? Well, okay, she was riding a little low in the water because of her cargo, but nothing the crew couldn't handle. 9 days pass, then 10. The Cyclops should have made it to Baltimore by now. 11 days. 12. Nothing. No distress signal. No debris. Remember, this is during World War I, so people initially thought maybe a German U-boat got her. But here's the thing. Germany later released their submarine records, and none of their U-boats were anywhere near the area. To this day, it remains the single largest loss of life in U.S. naval history not directly involving combat. Over 300 people gone without a trace. And what makes it even stranger, the Cyclops had 2 sister ships, almost identical in design. Want to guess what happened to them? They both disappeared in the same area years later. Now this is where we need to start asking some serious questions. What could make 3 massive ships, 5 military aircraft, and a search plane all vanish without leaving any trace? Is there something about this particular stretch of ocean that we're missing? That's exactly what the scientists have been trying to figure out in some of their theories. They're almost stranger than the mysteries themselves. Okay, let's talk science, and I mean really dig into it, because what's happening in the Bermuda Triangle isn't just about what we can see on the surface. We need to look at everything: the air above, the water below, and even what's happening deep beneath the ocean floor. First up, let's talk about one of the wildest theories that actually has some solid science behind it: methane bubbles. Deep under the ocean floor, there's these huge pockets of methane gas trapped in the sediment. Now, imagine if that methane suddenly burst through the seabed. You'd get these massive bubbles rising to the surface. And here's where it gets crazy. These bubbles can actually decrease the density of the water. Think about what happens when you drop an ice cube in a carbonated drink. All those bubbles make the ice cube bounce around, right? Now scale that up to ship size. A large enough methane bubble could literally create a spot where the water isn't dense enough to keep a ship floating. It's like suddenly trying to float in air instead of water. And we've actually found these methane pockets in the triangle area through geological surveys. But that's just what's happening below the surface. Let's talk about what's happening above. The Bermuda Triangle sits in this unique geographical position where it gets hit with some seriously weird weather patterns. You've got the Gulf Stream running through it, which is like a river of warm water in the ocean meeting cold air from the north. This creates something meteorologists call microbursts. Picture this: a column of cold air suddenly drops from the sky at speeds up to 170 miles per hour. These microbursts are like invisible fists punching down from the clouds. They're so powerful they can actually push a plane straight down into the ocean. And here's the really unsettling part: they can happen in otherwise clear weather. One minute you're flying smooth, the next, well, you get the idea. But there's something even stranger happening in the triangle, something that affects both ships and planes. I'm talking about electromagnetic anomalies. Now, we all know about the Earth's magnetic field, right? It's what makes our compasses work. But in the Bermuda Triangle, pilots and ship captains have reported their compasses just going haywire. In 2019, scientists discovered something fascinating. There's this thing called the South Atlantic anomaly. It's like a weak spot in Earth's magnetic field. Part of it extends into the Bermuda Triangle area. This means the magnetic field there isn't as strong or as stable as it should be, and in some spots the magnetic north on your compass might not be pointing to true north at all. But wait, it gets better. Remember that Gulf Stream I mentioned? It's not just affecting the weather. This massive current is moving millions of gallons of water, creating these giant underwater waves called internal waves. These things can be hundreds of feet tall, but you'd never see them from the surface. They move deep underwater, and when they hit the continental shelf, which happens right in the triangle area, they can create these massive surface waves that seem to come out of nowhere. Now let's connect these scientific phenomena to some of those famous disappearances. Take the USS Cyclops, for instance. We know she was riding low with all that manganese ore. Now, imagine she encounters one of these internal waves right where the continental shelf drops off. The ship could have been literally pulled under by forces the crew couldn't even see coming. And here's something wild. In 2019, scientists using satellite data, confirmed that rogue waves in the triangle can reach up to 100 feet high. That's as tall as a 10-story building. What makes these waves particularly deadly is that they don't behave like normal waves. They come from unexpected directions, often combining with other waves to create what scientists call constructive interference. Remember Flight 19, those compass problems they reported? Well, turns out the South Atlantic anomaly can actually cause something called magnetic fog. It's not fog you can see, it's more like a zone where magnetic fields become so distorted that both electronic and mechanical compasses become unreliable. In 2023, researchers found that these magnetic disturbances can also affect modern GPS systems. But here's where it gets really interesting. You know those methane bubbles we talked about? Scientists have discovered they don't just affect ships, they can affect aircraft too. When a large methane bubble reaches the surface, it creates a column of methane gas that rises into the air. If a plane flies through this invisible column, two dangerous things can happen. The methane can stall the engines, and the suddenly less dense air can reduce lift under the wings. Okay, let's talk about some recent research that's pretty mind-blowing. In 2021, oceanographers found what they call electronic fog in the triangle area. Now, this is a little different from the magnetic fog we talked about a minute ago. Electronic fog is this phenomenon where atmospheric conditions create a cloud of electrically charged particles. Ships and planes passing through these zones report complete electrical system failures, and we're talking modern vessels with multiple backup systems. But here's what I find most fascinating. It's probably never just one of these things causing a disappearance. Think about it like this. A ship encounters one of those internal waves which pushes it into an area of magnetic disturbance. The compass goes haywire, they get disoriented, and then they hit a patch of methane bubbles. It's like a perfect storm of natural phenomena. Geesh. No ship or plane could survive something like that. Okay, now let's look at some cases from just the past few decades, because contrary to what some people think, things are still vanishing in the triangle. Take the Witchcraft, and yes, that was her actual name, December 29th, 1967. Dan Burak and his friend took his 23-foot luxury cabin cruiser out to see the Christmas lights along the Miami shoreline. Just 1 mile from Miami Harbor, they reported engine trouble. That's it. When the Coast Guard arrived 19 minutes later, and I mean just 19 minutes, there was nothing. No debris, no oil slick, nothing. And here's the kicker. The Witchcraft had built-in flotation devices that should have kept it above water even if it sank. Based on what we now know about methane bubbles, this case is particularly interesting. The area where they disappeared sits right above a known methane hydrate bed. If a bubble burst at that exact moment, well, those flotation devices wouldn't help if the water itself couldn't provide buoyancy. Let's jump to something more recent. 2005, a Piper PA-46 Malibu disappeared between Treasure Cay in the Bahamas and Fort Pierce, Florida. The pilot reported 0 visibility conditions despite clear weather reports. Remember that electronic fog we talked about? The pilot's last radio transmission described white clouds that weren't showing up on radar. But perhaps the most compelling recent case is from 2015, the El Faro incident. This was a 790-foot cargo ship, a modern vessel, experienced crew, all the latest technology. They ran into Hurricane Joaquin, true, but here's what's odd. The ship's final position reports showed it going in circles, despite the crew thinking they were on a straight course. The investigation revealed something fascinating. Their electronic navigation systems had been affected by what they called unknown interference. Given what we now know about those magnetic anomalies in the region, this could explain why a modern ship with multiple GPS systems could become so disoriented. You know what's really interesting about these modern cases? We're finally getting hard data. Ships and planes nowadays are constantly sending out signals, recording data, tracking everything. And all this information is actually confirming some of those crazy stories from decades ago. Let me tell you about some cutting-edge research that's happening right now in the Triangle. It's pretty mind-blowing what we can do with modern technology. Right now, there's this amazing project called the Atlantic Trident Research Array. Scientists have placed a network of sophisticated sensors across the Triangle floor. We're talking about devices that can detect everything from magnetic field fluctuations to methane releases in real time. It's like having 1,000 tiny scientists stationed across the ocean floor, all reporting back 24/7. And the data they're collecting? Fascinating stuff. They've recorded these massive methane bursts that can release millions of cubic feet of gas in just minutes. We're talking about bubbles bigger than the Statue of Liberty rising from the seafloor. In fact, in 2022, they detected the largest methane release ever recorded in the region, a bubble field nearly 2 miles wide. But it gets better. Remember those internal waves we talked about? Scientists are now using satellite technology called synthetic aperture radar to track them from space. They've discovered these waves can actually stack on top of each other, creating these underwater mountains of moving water that can rise up to the surface with almost no warning. And here's something that'll blow your mind. They're using artificial intelligence to analyze weather patterns in the Triangle. This AI has identified what they call atmospheric holes, places where the air density suddenly changes. Think about that for a second. These aren't just random patches of turbulence. They're like invisible sinkholes in the sky. But perhaps the most exciting research is happening with magnetometers. These super sensitive devices can detect tiny changes in magnetic fields, and they've found something strange. There are these moving magnetic anomalies in the Triangle. There are actually areas where the magnetic field strength changes and actually moves around, almost like magnetic whirlpools. These underwater robots, they call them AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles, are mapping the Triangle's sea floor in incredible detail. Think of them like underwater drones, but way more sophisticated. One of these AUVs, nicknamed Deep Whisper, is doing something unprecedented. It can scan the sea floor down to actually resolution of just a few centimeters, and what it's finding is fascinating. There are these massive underwater craters, some up to half a mile wide. Scientists think these are collapse features from ancient methane explosions. But here's the wild part. Some of these craters are still active. In 2023, they sent Deep Whisper to investigate one of these craters, and they caught something remarkable on camera. The robot recorded what they call a methane cascade. Imagine an underwater waterfall, but instead of water, it's methane gas bubbling up through fissures in the rock. The pressure gauges on the robot went haywire during the event. And as if that's not enough, these robots have also discovered something else: underwater landslides, massive ones. The continental shelf in the triangle area is like a giant underwater cliff, and sometimes huge chunks just break off. When that happens, it can create these enormous underwater avalanches that we can't see from the surface. That's not all. They've started using swarms of these robots, sometimes up to 20 at once, to create real-time 3D maps of ocean currents. They've found these bizarre circular current patterns that shouldn't exist according to our traditional understanding of ocean dynamics. It's like the water's moving in ways that defy our models. Now, while all that is interesting, do you want to know the most exciting part? They're about to launch what they call Project Horizon, a 5-year study using next generation robots that can stay underwater for months at a time. These new AUVs will carry something special: quantum magnetometers. These are so sensitive they can detect changes in the Earth's magnetic field smaller than a billionth of a Tesla. These quantum magnetometers are absolutely revolutionary. Unlike traditional magnetic sensors, they use something called spin states, basically using supercooled atoms to detect magnetic fields. They're so sensitive they can pick up magnetic changes that would be completely invisible to normal equipment. Here's what they've found so far. There are these magnetic bubbles in the triangle areas where the Earth's magnetic field doesn't just weaken, it actually flips and swirls. Imagine dropping food coloring in water and watching it spiral around. That's what the magnetic field is doing in these spots, but invisible to the naked eye. In fact, during one research mission in late 2023, one of these quantum magnetometers detected something unprecedented, a magnetic vortex that actually moved across the ocean. It was like a magnetic whirlpool traveling along the Gulf Stream. The readings were so strange that at first they thought that their equipment was malfunctioning, but all 20 sensors picked up the same thing. And here's where it gets really wild. They've started correlating these magnetic anomalies with other data. Every time they detect one of these magnetic vortexes, they also pick up changes in water temperature, air pressure, and this is the crazy part: the electrical conductivity of the air itself. It's like these magnetic disturbances are creating their own microenvironments. I mean, you can just imagine what that would do to a passing ship or aircraft. The next phase of Project Horizon is going to use these quantum magnetometers alongside something called muon detectors. Muons are particles from space that pass through pretty much everything, and by tracking how they move through the triangle, scientists might be able to create a kind of CT scan of what's happening beneath the ocean floor. You know what's fascinating about all this? The more advanced our technology gets, the more we realize that those old stories about compass problems and electrical failures, they weren't just sailors' tales. There's real, measurable science behind them. Let's talk about how all this research is changing the way we navigate through the triangle. Because believe it or not, ships and planes are already using some pretty incredible new technology based on what we've learned. Remember those magnetic vortexes we talked about? Well, shipping companies are now testing what they call quantum compass systems. Unlike traditional compasses or even GPS, these new navigation tools don't rely on magnetic fields or satellite signals. Instead, they use supercooled atoms to detect the ship's movement relative to Earth's rotation. Nothing in the triangle can mess with that. And here's something really cool. They're rolling out this new weather prediction system specifically for the triangle. It combines artificial intelligence with those underwater sensors we talked about. If it detects a methane bubble building up or one of those magnetic anomalies forming, it can alert ships and planes in real time. Think of it like a weather radar, but for underwater and magnetic disturbances. Airlines are getting in on this too. They're testing new autopilot systems that can detect sudden changes in air density, like those atmospheric holes we mentioned. This system can react faster than any human pilot, automatically adjusting the aircraft position before it hits dangerous turbulence. But perhaps the most exciting development is something called the Digital Triangle Project. They're creating a virtual map of the entire region that updates in real time. Every ship, every underwater sensor, every weather station feeds data into this system. It's like having a living, breathing model of everything happening in the triangle at once. And get this, they're even testing autonomous ships in the triangle. These unmanned vessels are packed with sensors, deliberately sailing through areas where ships have disappeared in the past. They're collecting data that would be too dangerous for crewed ships to gather. Now, that is something. You know what's really incredible about all this? We're not just solving an old mystery. We're using what we've learned to make shipping and aviation safer everywhere in the world. The Bermuda Triangle is actually helping us understand how oceans and atmosphere interact in ways we never imagined. So here we are at the intersection of mystery and science. The Bermuda Triangle has been puzzling us for centuries, but maybe that's exactly what we needed. A mystery big enough to push us to look deeper, think harder, and develop better technology. You know what's fascinating? The more we learn about the triangle, the more we realize it's not just one phenomenon causing all these disappearances. It's like a perfect storm of natural forces all coming together in one place. Magnetic anomalies, methane bubbles, rogue waves, and probably some things we haven't even discovered yet. But here's the thing, we're not destroying the mystery by understanding it better. If anything, we're discovering that the truth is even more incredible than the legends. I mean, who would have thought we'd find moving magnetic whirlpools or underwater methane waterfalls? The Bermuda Triangle isn't just a place where ships and planes disappear anymore. It's become this amazing natural laboratory where we're learning about forces that affect our entire planet. Every disappearance, every strange compass reading, every unexplained event, they're all pieces of a puzzle that's helping us understand our world better. Now, we can't talk about the Bermuda Triangle without diving into how it's captured our cultural imagination. The way this mystery has shaped pop culture is pretty fascinating. You know how when something starts snowballing and suddenly it's everywhere? That's exactly what happened with the triangle in the 1970s. It all really kicked off with Charles Berlitz's 1974 book, The Bermuda Triangle. This thing was a phenomenon, sold over 20 million copies in hardback alone. That's more copies than most bestsellers today sell in all formats combined. But here's what's interesting. Berlitz's book, like many that followed, did something clever. They took real disappearances, real mysteries, but let's say they added some creative flourishes. For instance, Um, when describing the Flight 19 disappearance, some authors added details about mysterious lights and strange radio transmissions that weren't in any official reports. And then there's my personal favorite piece of triangle lore, the claim that Christopher Columbus saw a great flame of fire crash into the ocean and recorded a mysterious light in the sky. What they don't usually mention is that Columbus actually wrote about seeing what was most likely a meteor, and he also noted that it was a perfectly normal occurrence that sailors often witnessed. Hollywood, of course, couldn't resist. We've seen everything from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, using the triangle as a plot point, to dedicated films like the Triangle series. Even the X-Files got in on the action. These shows and movies usually follow a pattern. They take real disappearances and add aliens, time portals, or lost civilizations, which, while entertaining, is misleading, only serves to create a false narrative. But here's where we need to pump the brakes and look at some actual numbers. Lloyd's of London, the famous insurance market, did a study of accident rates in the Triangle. Want to know what they found? The number of ships and aircraft that go missing in the Triangle isn't actually any higher than in other similarly busy areas of ocean. In fact, when you look at the statistics, something interesting emerges. Between 1945 and 1975, the period when most of the famous triangle literature was being published, there were about 44 ships and planes reported missing in the area. That sounds like a lot, right? But during the same period, the same number or more went missing in other major shipping lanes of similar size. The really interesting part is how these factual statistics haven't dampened our fascination with the triangle at all. If anything, they've just added another layer to the mystery. Why do we remain so captivated by this particular stretch of ocean? The Bermuda Triangle has found a whole new life online. It's pretty amazing how this decades-old mystery has adapted to the digital age. You know those TikTok rabbit holes people fall into at 2 a.m.? The Bermuda Triangle is absolutely crushing it there. Videos with hashtags like Bermuda Triangle and Triangle Mystery have racked up billions, yes, billions of views. And what's really interesting is how there's social media creators are mixing old mysteries with new scientific discoveries. Take YouTube, for example. There's this whole community of creators using modern animation and graphics to visualize those methane bubbles and magnetic anomalies we talked about earlier. Some of these videos have better special effects than Hollywood movies from just a few years ago. They're making complex scientific concepts accessible to millions of people. And podcasts? Oh man, the Triangle has become this perfect storm for podcast storytelling. You've got true crime podcasts investigating specific disappearances, science podcasts breaking down the latest research, even comedy podcasts poking fun at some of the wilder theories. The mystery has found a way to appeal to pretty much every audience. But here's what's really fascinating about the Triangle in the social media age: real-time tracking. People are using ship and aircraft tracking websites to monitor vessels passing through the Triangle. Every time there's even a slight delay or course change, you'll find Twitter threads trying to solve the mystery. It's like we've got thousands of amateur investigators watching the Triangle 24/7. The irony is, in an age where we can literally track ships on our phones, the Bermuda Triangle still manages to maintain its mystique. Maybe that's because, deep down, we all want some mysteries to remain unsolved. You know what's really interesting about the future of the Bermuda Triangle? It's becoming this perfect intersection of mystery and technology. Picture this. Within the next decade, we'll have thousands of tiny autonomous drones constantly monitoring the triangle. They'll be collecting data about everything from magnetic fields to weather patterns. Some tech companies are already developing what they call smart buoys, floating sensors that can detect everything from underwater methane releases to changes in the Earth's magnetic field. Social media and citizen science are changing the game too. There's this project called Triangle Watch, where regular people can help monitor satellite data for anomalies. It's like having a global team of mystery investigators, all connected through their smartphones. But here's what I find most fascinating. The more technology we throw at the triangle, the more questions we seem to uncover. Every new discovery leads to new mysteries. It's like the triangle is this giant puzzle that keeps revealing new pieces just when we think we're close to solving it. You know what they say, the more we know, the more we realize how much we don't know. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Bermuda Triangle. It's not just a place where ships and planes disappeared. It's become this driving force, pushing us to better understand our oceans, our atmosphere, and even our planet's magnetic field. So, what's next for the triangle? Well, as our technology gets better, we'll probably solve some of its mysteries. But something tells me this patch of ocean will keep surprising us. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. After all, in a world where we think we've got everything figured out, isn't it nice to have a place that still makes us wonder? This has been Legends and Lore. I'm David Culpepper. Thanks for joining me on this journey into one of the world's most fascinating mysteries. Until next time, keep exploring.